Go ahead and take a seat. We'll wait for Thelma to come over. It's good to have Scott and Thelma visiting with us this evening. Up visiting family from Chickasha, and wanted to make sure they had an opportunity to visit with the church family here. We're thankful for that. We have now been engaged in 1 Corinthians 11 and the head covering issue for a couple of weeks now, and we'll hopefully finish that up tonight. I started a new class last week, and we had it was on the New Testament world, and the whole purpose of the class is looking at the background of the New Testament. So like when it talks about Paul being in prison, what were Roman prisons like? That type deal. And so we have to do a major paper on some cultural issue, that parallels in the New Testament, or has some effect on the New Testament. So we met on a Tuesday, and first thing Wednesday morning, I sent him my topic that I wanted to do, and I said I would like to do the head covering issue because we're already studying it here on Wednesday nights. I thought this is great. I've already downloaded some good scholarly works on it. I'll have to have a few more. And he said, I'm sorry, someone has already chosen that topic. Now, mind you, this was from the end of class at 7:30 the night before to 7:30 the next morning that I emailed him. And then I found out yesterday that only 2 people have picked a topic. It was that other guy and me. No one else has picked a topic yet, and so it was one for one of the topics that I wanted, and I didn't get it. So now I'm doing a history of Caesarea Philippi. It has nothing to do with the head coverings in 1 Corinthians, but I think it'll be an interesting study nonetheless. But there is a lot of information that is surrounding this. In fact, I think I mentioned Richard Oster's article on the men covering their hair. In fact, are covering their heads. And that's an interesting topic because generally when we come to 1 Corinthians 11, we're concerned about the women, right? And yet Paul is just as emphatic in this passage about the men not covering their heads. And so that's kind of an area that's been left off of the discussion about this. And Richard Oster, I believe he at the time was teaching at Harding Graduate School. Anyway, he looks at it and he says, you know what, we need to have some information on the men too. Of course, that was like back in 1989 or so it's not a real recent article. It's hard for me to imagine that 1989 is like, almost 40 years ago. It's a long time ago now. It just seems like yesterday, right? But anyway, so it's a good discussion, and as we're going through this, we're in this section now where he's talking about in verses 8, 9, 10, 11, the man and the woman and their creative order being created for one another. Woman was created for man, not man for the woman, and things like that. But don't let that, Paul might say, dissuade you and make you think that women are not important, because they're vitally important. And he comes down to that. He says, for as woman was made from man, in verse 12, so man is now born of woman. Woman is as essential to the creative order as man is, right? There's the only time in human history where the next generation has come from a situation without both a man and a woman is what? It's Jesus, right? The miraculous birth of Jesus. And so that's the only time in human history that's ever happened. And it was the woman who did it by herself and not man. And so the idea that Paul is getting at is that women and men are different. I know that statement is controversial today, but men and women are different. And we see that in so many ways, but probably the most obvious way is physiologically. We're different. We have different bodies. We could go further. Studies show that men and women have different minds. They have different emotions. They have different expectations. They have different desires. It's just the way it is. Men and women are different. You know, it's interesting. Today there is a huge push for women getting into STEM fields, right? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM. And because traditionally these fields or these disciplines have been dominated by men. But in the studies that have been shown, psychological studies of men and women, most women aren't interested in science, technology, engineering, and mathematical fields. Are there some? Sure, there's some. But the vast majority of women couldn't care less about science. But is that going to stop us from trying to level the playing field and make sure there's as many STEM students that are girls as there are STEM students that are boys? No. We're still going to try to make everything equal instead of recognizing there are differences. Differences between men and women, physiologically, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, familially. I mean, we can go on and on and on with this list of how they are different. But instead of saying because they're different, men are more important, women are not important, Paul comes along and he says, no, but understand they are both vitally important, not just for the procreation, not just for the furtherance of the human race, though that's one that he picks out here when he says man is now born of woman, but for all things, for a well-balanced society, we need men and women participating, period. We can leave it at that because that is enough to show the essential nature of both men and women. And then he says, and of course all things are from God, meaning, of course, that God actually creates all things. Even though men come from women, you notice he doesn't put the implication alongside that. Women are also coming from women, right? The idea is we understand. Point is they're both vitally important, but they are both beholden to God, because all things come from him. So he begins verse 13 with a very interesting phrase: "Judge for yourselves." Now, some have taken this to saying, okay, Paul's saying, okay, here's the overarching principle that is from God. Now you judge whether you're going to follow that. Judge for yourselves whether you understand this to be the case. I don't think that that's exactly what Paul is saying. I think what Paul is saying is, now in this particular instance of the question of men covering their head and women uncovering their head, he says you need to be the judge. You need to look at this and understand for yourselves. Remember that the language that Paul is using throughout all of this is nature, custom, practice. These are not words of commandment. These are words of what is expedient, right? Paul had already told us all things are lawful, but not all things are, some translations say expedient, some say advantageous. Not all have an advantage. And so the idea is these are some areas that we have to put on our thinking caps. I think I said last week we don't like to put on thinking caps because thinking hurts. Not only does thinking hurt or it gives us headaches, but as we think, we have to take responsibility for the things we come up with. And we generally don't like to take responsibility for anything in our culture. So everything seems to be against that. But he says, I want you to judge for yourself. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? And so he's asking them this question based upon your culture in Corinth and how women are viewed and how men are viewed. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Now, it's hard for us to answer that question. Why? Because we don't live in first century Corinth, right? We live in 21st century America. So take that question and apply it today. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered today? And I don't think there's an overarching cultural principle that says that it is or it is not. Right? We talked a little bit about some possibilities, but really when it comes down to it, it's not a cultural thing. Now, are there some religious organizations that are very adamant about this? I was in an office yesterday visiting with some people, and one of the ladies says, I'm dating a man. He's from Oklahoma. I think they, when they found out we were from Oklahoma, we must know each other. Anyway, he's from Oklahoma, and he grew up in a church where women wore head coverings and didn't cut their hair and so forth like that. And she said, he looks at it now as being rather cultic, okay, like it's an occult or something. I hate that word cultic because all it means is worship. The cultic is a group of people that worship. Now, what they worship, that makes a difference to me anyway. But anyway, we generally use that term in a very pejorative way. But she's asking this question, do people still wear head coverings? Because the community at large thinks nothing of it. Nothing. I mean, most people do not see a woman in public with her head covered and think, she must truly recognize the authority of God. It's simply not there. And so when he's asking them to judge for themselves, what does their culture relate? He's asking us the same thing. What does our culture relate? Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Interestingly, if we're going to take this as a standard by which we must live today, what about the woman who's just finished cooking dinner and they sit down and they're about to pray and she doesn't have anything on her head? It would seem to me that if culture is demanding that the head be covered, she needs to maybe pull the apron up over her head or go get something and cover her head with it, if we're going to be consistent. It's not just when we're in a church building. It's when a woman is worshiping in prayer or prophesying, as he says earlier in the context. Still, under the heading of judge for yourselves, does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? And so now we're shifting view from the woman to the man, or it would appear so. I don't think that's exactly what's happening, but this is how we use 1 Corinthians 11:16 anyways, or 11:14, as we come in and we say it's a sin for a man to wear long hair. Nature itself tells you this, right? In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 3, he says, he's talking about these Christians in the time past when they used to walk in sin. They were, of the devil, things like that. And he says, you were by nature children of wrath. Phusis. Now, the question is how were they by nature? What does it mean to say someone is by nature something? What do we mean by that? Born that way. You were born children of wrath. Is that what Paul means? I mean, he tells them you were by nature children of wrath. So this Greek word, phusis, its primary meaning is nature, as we would think of nature, born that way or inherent that way. But another meaning, and Bedag gives this as one, Vines mentions it in his dictionary of New Testament words, it can mean something along the lines of by long habit and practice, something has become nature to you. We might say it's become second nature type deal, right? And so that's how it can be used, that by habit or by practice, you have become children of wrath. Now, does that fit with the overall context of the New Testament and of the Word of God? That they were by nature children of wrath. They were children of wrath because of their habits and practices, not because they were born that way. but because they became that way through their habits and practice. That fits with the overall context of all the scriptures, of Paul's argument in Ephesians chapter 2, by the way, as well as the remote context of the New Testament. I mean, it fits everywhere. Saying that they were born children of wrath does not fit with the overall scheme of the gospel and of the New Testament, of the whole Bible. So we have to take it there with BDAG's meaning that it's a habit and practice. Now, Paul, judge for yourself. Is it proper? Is it according to your culture? How's culture established? Tradition? He's mentioned tradition here. Practice? Habit? Is he asking that human nature itself, doesn't that tell us it's a disgrace for a man to have long hair? Or is he saying that does not culture in its habits and practice tell you that men with long hair is a disgrace? Well, in the context, it would appear that it's more along the lines of habit and practice. As this is Paul's entire argument. In fact, he's going to get down to the very verse 16. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice. You see, that's the context that we're in. So, I know some of us have longer hair than others. Some we got older and it turned gray. Some we got older, it turned loose. Hair is different on men. Somewhere along, how long is long? What does culture tell us about men and long hair today? Nothing. So we as Christians ought to be a little more discerning when we see someone with long hair walk into a church building, or a man with long hair walk into a church building. Now, we may have a personal dislike for that. That's possible. But we can't look at that and say, well, look, his hair is too long, he's in sin. Nature should have told him that. Well, I don't think our culture looks at the length of a man's hair anymore and determines if he's right or wrong. Nor, notice here's the flip side of it, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. Now, to me, that's Paul's real point, that the woman's hair is a glory to her. He's already mentioned, cutting her hair off and things like that. But nature says, or the culture says that's a disgrace. What does culture today say about women who cut their hair, shave their hair, or let their hair grow? Tim?
It's irrelevant.
It's irrelevant. It has no bearing on her standing before God or before culture. Now, if culture had a design or a specific thing and said, well, this is how we expect all women to wear their hair, and this is how we expect all men to wear their hair. And if they're outside of these things, then we will look upon them as prostitutes or as degenerates or, whatever list we're going to put in there. Then as Christians, we should take that into account. If culture itself is telling us those things. Now, are there places in the world where culture might demand certain hairstyles of men or women? Yes. And that's one other reason why when you lay down tonight and you're thanking God for all the things you have, thank God you're in a culture that does not require that. Her hair is given to her for what? A covering. Now what's interesting here is the word used for covering here is nothing like the words covering earlier in the passage. Remember we used the word katakalupto. I mentioned that. That's the one that's used for covering throughout the context. But not here. This one is, it's from where we get the word parable. Remember parable is para, preposition para, attached to the word bole, parabole, and it means, bole means to throw, okay, to throw. And so para means alongside of, so throw alongside of. And That's kind of the idea of a parable, is it's been cast beside a story with, to have another lesson. That's a parable. Well, this is peribale. Okay? A different prefix. Instead of para, it's peri. And it means around. And it has the idea of to throw around. This is what prompted a lot of people when they come to the context to say the covering in 1 Corinthians 11 for the woman is her long hair. And that to put it on top of her head is to wrap it around, maybe like a beehive or a bun, and to place it atop or near the crown of her head. That in itself tells me something about this context. Is this a piece of cloth that is wrapped around the head? Maybe. Is it the hair? Well, it appears here her hair is given to her for something to wrap around her head, right? Or to throw around, we might say. I don't think that's, the women with the long hair going, throwing their hair around. I don't think that's the idea. I really think it's the idea of wrapping up. And so, by the way, those in the church and outside the church that believe that women should not cut their hair at all do generally wrap their hair, don't they? It's a common practice. So is her covering her hair? Is the covering fabric? Is the covering a mental attitude? I think when we look at this and see, the confusion comes because this is not our culture. And if it's not our culture, then we shouldn't try to force first century Corinth into 21st century America. Now, if someone says, look, I've got questions about it, there's enough questions in my mind, if it's a woman, she says, I'm going to cover my head when I come to worship. Not a problem. And maybe her husband says, I agree with her, and I want her to wear a head covering, and she wears a head covering. Not a problem. There's no problem with someone who takes this as something, as a custom that has to be done today, right? We get along with people like that. When does a problem come in? Tim?
This is the way I want it. You are going to do it.
Exactly. This is the way I see it, and the whole church has to follow it. And we have those here who apply this to themselves. To my knowledge, don't force it on anyone else. That's their choice, and there's nothing wrong with that. And they should not be looked down upon or considered less Christian or ignorant of the Scriptures. That's simply not the case. There's enough question here that I say it demands us to be tolerant of different understandings of this passage. Scott?
Could it be just as simple as the fact that whatever culture you're in, a man needs to look like a man and a woman needs to look like a woman in that culture?
I think that's the impact of 14 and 15, yes. That, are there, look, man with long hair, it doesn't mean a lot. Can a man wear his hair in such a way he looks like a woman? And people confuse him for a woman. Yeah.
Can cultures change?
Cultures do change.
Can they change biblically?
Yes, absolutely. That's Paul's question here is you judge. You be the judge of this. How are you fitting into your culture? Christianity has already got a hard row to hoe, right? That's an old saying from the South. It's a hard row to hoe. It's tough. We're trying to convince people who are, especially in our country, who are well off, who are at peace with their choices, and who are living in sin, and they don't think a thing about it. And we're trying to convince them, well, the way you're living is not really good, and you need to come and be washed in the blood of Christ and change how you live your life completely. That's not real popular with a lot of people. It's a tough row to hoe. So why be so counterculture when we don't have to be and add more difficulty? And I think that's what Scott's getting at is, we can adapt to culture. Now, listen, if the culture was that men and women wore loincloths and that was it, as some African cultures are, then, we couldn't follow that culture. Right? I mean, there are some limits on how this is going to be applied. But where God has left it open, we need to be open enough to comply with our expectations of cultures. When the expectation of culture goes against the will of God, which one do we choose? We choose God every time. Terry?
I was thinking, we're talking about a husband and wife going into church, praying and prophesying, and a woman needs to keep her head covered. I was wondering if they're thinking about God in this relationship of husband and wife, and how they come before God. Do they show respect by covering the woman's head and not covering the man's head? Because he's the king that they're worshiping.
I think that's part of it, yes. I mean, they have to be concerned about God. And the whole point of all of this is, just as God, does all things, that was the statement, at the end of verse 9 or 10 or 12, all things are from God, just as all things are from God. We have to understand that we do all things for God. And so whenever we do enter into worship, we're here for God. Okay. Any final comment? Man, we've almost beat this dead horse to death. Ivan?
I was going to say, I think we have somewhat the same thing today with like men's suits.
Okay.
You go back 30 years and every man wore a suit, unless you were in Texas, and then they wore the best bib overalls they had.
Right.
But, I mean, that was the custom to wear a suit.
Yes.
And now it has gone the other way.
Yes.
And it's not right or wrong, but I think then it becomes your preference.
It does. It becomes preference. And look, you've got people that walk into a church building that hadn't been in a church in years. And they're already timid. They're scared to death how people are going to think about them. They're walking in with jeans and a T-shirt, and they see every man in the building in a suit. And what are they going to do? They turn around and walk out. They're gone. It's just the way it is. I mean, they don't want to come in and be the odd man out. But, and I'll come right back to you, Ivan, go back and look at men at a baseball game, attending a baseball game in the 1940s and 50s. They're wearing suits, full suits, in August with a fedora. That's why. Because that's what was expected of men in the culture at the time. Go to the same two teams playing in the same stadium today, and how many suits and fedoras will you find? None. So culture does impact, and that's one of the things that Scott was asking is, can culture change? Yes, and biblically it can change. God expected it to change. It changed from, Jerusalem did not behave the same way that Corinth behaved, even at the same time. The Jews in Jerusalem did not behave as the Jews in Corinth in the same year. Culture changes. Do you have something else to add?
I was going to say, I was asked home to San Saba over a weekend with another student, and he said, be sure to take a suit. I said, well, because we wore suits in college, and I think that was for church services, because it was going to be the weekend. When we went to the football game Friday night, we wore our suits. We went to church Sunday and just worked them. So the suit was for the ball game.
The suit was that San Saba, Texas?
Yeah.
And the mighty armadillos? All right. They are the San Saba armadillos. Verse 17. Let's move from this one worship context to another issue in worship that Paul wants to address. But in the following instructions, I do not commend you. Now remember back in verse 2, he said, I commend you, for doing the right thing. And he gives them some instruction, maybe a little correction as well. But in the end, he does tell them, you're judging this for yourself about culture and how it applies to you. But he says in the following instructions, I do not commend you. In other words, there's nothing good about what you're doing with the Lord's Supper, right? Because when you come together And I have this little icon on here of the man bowing before God. That's what that little purple thing is, if you're wondering. I put that a lot of times in my text here when it's a worship context or when a statement is made about worshiping. And I think that's the idea here. When you come together, when you assemble, remember the word ecclesia, which translates church, means assemble, right? It means to assemble. And so when you come together, when you assemble, it is not for better but for worse. In other words, your worship services are turning out, they should be something that you enjoy and something that is spiritually uplifting to you and makes you a better Christian. But he says, when you come together, what's happening? You walk away worse off than you were when you came. It's almost like he's saying it would be better for you not to come to worship if this is what your worship is going to look like. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I believe it in part. And so there are divisions, or there are factions, and he's heard this. And it's interesting because in verse 18, he says, in the first place, so what do you expect later on in the context? In the second place, or a follow-up of some sort, right? But he doesn't actually get to that point. In fact, whenever he gets to the end of the context, he says, about the other things, I'll give directions when I come. So it's kind of the classic cliffhanger, and this is the Pauline cliffhanger. In the first place, and I'll tell you the rest when I get there. I love that about Paul. Why? Because this is the one that was pressing. This is the one that was most important to him. So in the first place, when you come together as a church, when you assemble as the assembly, that's what he's saying, when you come together. Now, he doesn't just, say when you assemble as the assembly every time. He says when you come together. Why do you think he uses the drawn-out phrase, when you come together, instead of the word assemble, which would encompass that entire phrase?
More emphasis.
Huh?
More emphasis.
More emphasis on what?
The assembly, what you're doing there.
Okay?
The choice to come.
The choice to come, the assembly, I think you're hitting around it. What's the word, though, that he uses? Together. Together. What is worship about? It's about togetherness. Yes, we've come to worship God. But can't I worship God at home? Can I pray to God at home? Well, I better be. Can I sing praises to God at home? Absolutely. So what's the point of coming together? The together. That's the point of coming together. It's that we as Christians, as the children of God, we need one another. We need each other's presence. We need our fellowship. We need the encouragement. We need the love. We need the contact and the interaction. Right? The story is told of the old preacher who went to the man who had laid out his services for quite some time. And the old man knew why he was coming. The preacher was coming to tell him that he needed to get back in church and all those things. On this particular day, it was a little cool outside. The man had been burning a fire in the fireplace. The preacher came in and didn't say a word to him. Walked over to the fire and got a poker and drug a coal, a red-hot coal, out of the fire and just left it on the hearth. And he sat down. And over the next 10 or 15 minutes, the coal went from red to orange to black. The preacher stood up and the man said, I'll be there next Sunday. By ourselves, we tend to lose our fire, right? So that's why we come together. That's why we're here on Wednesday nights, because we want to fan those flames throughout the week. We assemble for that purpose. So when you come together, now, is it possible to come together as the church and it not be beneficial? Yeah. He says it's not for better, but it's for worse. What should be a benefit to you is not benefiting you. Why? Because there are divisions or factions among you. The church is divided. It's possible for a church to have a split and no one leave the building. J.D. Tant's biography. J.D. Tant was a Texas preacher in the late 1800s. in early 1900s. I believe he died in 1910. But he was one of these guys that was constantly on the go doing gospel meetings in this town, and this town, this town, this town. And he gets to one church, and they told him that, Brother Tant, when we asked you to come, we were a good church, but we've had some issues, but we've worked through them. There were some on one side of a particular issue and some on the other side of that particular issue. But they worked through them. And by that, what they did is they brought in a second pulpit, and they turned this section of pews facing that way with the pulpit over there, and this section facing this way with the pulpit over here. And they just told Brother Tant about halfway through his lesson, if he'll move to the other pulpit and preach to the other people, we've worked through our problems. Listen, they had a split. This is a church that is not healthy. There are divisions in the church. And they have not worked through anything. They've simply tried to sweep it under the rug. Paul says, I've heard there are factions among you. Well, what's been the problem in 1 Corinthians all along? What is our subtitle of this class? 1 Corinthians, how to heal what? Divisions. And so he's bringing up, here's some other things you're dividing over. When we get into chapter 12 and 13 and 14, when he's dealing with miraculous gifts, what are they doing with the miraculous gifts? They're dividing over it. We go back to chapter 1, what are they dividing over? Who baptized them, the wisdom that they had, who was building on whose work. They're a divided church. And so Paul says, I hear there's divisions among you, and I believe it in part. In other words, he's getting a report. And sometimes those reports might be embellished. What Paul is saying is, I have no reason not to believe this. I believe it. Then he says, for there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. So is Paul condoning division in the church? There must be factions among you? No. So what does he mean by telling them there must be factions?
Acting the way they are.
Okay. When some are acting the way they are acting, there better be divisions, because there has to be some looking at some of this, the way they're acting and they're behaving and saying, that's wrong. And we are not going to tolerate that. And I think you're on the right track. Tim, did you have another thought on that?
I was just thinking, it wouldn't have been reported back to Paul. I've heard this, and I believe it. If it wasn't some remnant of truth there somewhere,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, how'd it get started?
Well, the way it gets started is there are some who are misbehaving, and there are some who are genuine in their faith, and there is a stark contrast between the two. Is that any different than today? Do we see in the church sometimes stark contrast between those who are genuine and recognized for the genuineness of their faith, and those who are not genuine, those who are merely dabbling? I like that word, dabbling. Dabbling Christians. There are dabbling Christians. They're not into it wholeheartedly, but they're sitting on the dock and dangling their toes in the water. And then there are those Christians who run off the end of the dock with a scream, plunge into the water, and they're all in. Which ones do you think please God? Do you have a comment, Keith? Yeah, the ones that run off the end of the dock and jump in the water, exactly. Those are the ones that are going to please God. And because they are giving in wholeheartedly. It says, when you come together, there's that phrase again. It's almost like Paul saying, I want you to understand what we're talking about, brothers. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry, another gets drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not. And in fact, that last phrase is very emphatic. There is no possible way that I will commend you in behaving this way. So, they're coming together. It's a harm to them. It's hurting their faith, because when they come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. Now, sometime by the beginning of the 2nd century, we have arise what's referred to as the love feast, the agape feast. And we would liken that similar to our fellowship meal today. Okay. And so there are some who are saying, well, what they're doing here is they're treating the Lord's Supper like one of the agape feasts. The problem with that particular interpretation is there's no indication the agape feasts were around in the 1st century, the love feast. There's a reference to something akin to it, maybe in Jude, but for the most part, we don't see that this is influencing Paul in any way. I don't think the problem is that they were eating a meal alongside the Lord's Supper. How did they partake the Lord's Supper? Well, notice what they're doing. One goes ahead with his own meal. One is hungry, and another what? Gets drunk. How do you get drunk? How do you get drunk? You've got to drink what? Alcohol. How much do you have to drink to get drunk? Well, in the 1st century, if you're drinking wine, it had to be quite a bit. But isn't it interesting that they could get drunk off the Lord's Supper? Now, some have come along and said, well, this word drunk here can mean to be filled up. And that sounds good. It's just not true. In the Bible, where it condemns drunkenness and things like that, guess what word it uses? This word right here. It's drunk. They could get drunk off the Lord's Supper. Why? Well, what were they drinking? Fruit of the vine, right? They had to be drinking the fruit of the vine, otherwise it's not the Lord's Supper. The fruit of the vine represented the blood. And so they're drinking fruit of the vine. How did they keep it from fermenting? W.D. Jeffcoat has an entire book on the Bible and social drinking, and how the word oinos, wine, can be fermented or unfermented wine. And it's this very thoroughly researched book. Unfortunately, is not true. None of it's true. Oinos in the Greek, yain in the Hebrew, means alcoholic wine. That's all it ever means. There's one passage in Isaiah where he's talking about the potentiality of the wine in the cluster. That's usually when we say, well, when it's in the cluster, it doesn't. It's not fermented, so yayin must refer to unfermented wine. But all Isaiah is talking about is the prosperity of the land and the potential of wine that comes from the grape. Now, so you squeeze the grape, you can have juice, which is one word, grape juice, and you can have wine, which is another word. And you don't get drunk on just juice. And so it would seem to me that in this case, the grape juice could be fermented. Is it definite? Did they always have fermented? I don't think so. I think it was what they could get. The commandment is what? Fruit of the vine. Fruit of the vine. That's the command. And so that's what they needed to be drinking. Was it fermented or unfermented? I don't know. Paul's thinking, if you drink enough of it, you can get drunk. But that's still not the issue that he has with the Lord's Supper, that they're getting drunk necessarily. we'll have to pick up there next week. I'll tell you the rest when I see you. Again, thank you for your attention. Terry?
Could the issue be some were taking the Lord's Supper in excess and some were giving any at all?
I think that's a big part of it, yes. And I think that's the answer for the issue that's going to come up. But, hey, look, there's my microphone. Apparently I had it muted. Felt like I was yelling.